Much of your work is obviously focused on women as a divorce coach, but you also work with male clients. Your focus is on supporting non toxic partners who want to end marriages. That's what this is about for you. For today's podcast, we are focused on abusive and unhealthy marriages, whether physically or emotionally or both, but marriages that are really truly in name only and which need to end for the sake of the non toxic partner and the children, obviously, for the sake of the children. First question, in a way, are you crusading for the sanctity of divorce?
Yes, I guess so. And I'm not afraid to be labeled that. I've been on national news shows pitted against some of these staunch supporters of marriage who believe that people should be trapped in a marriage, even if it's unhealthy, even if it's, endangering their mental health. So, yes, and I think now more than ever, with what we have going on in our country, this is really important to shine a light on.
And people who listen to my podcast know that I am divorced. I don't go into a lot of detail. At the end of the day, what matters is the kids and everybody's mental health, and we're great. Not a lot of people are so lucky. Let's take a step back. So, for those who don't know your story, of my listeners, you've been open about surviving domestic abuse and divorce twice. Can you tell me, how bad did it get for you? And what was the moment when you really had a light bulb about something had to change for you?
Right. Well, I always say that, this is an exclusive club when you've been divorced not once, but twice. I'm joking. Never thought I would be saying that ever in my life. And I think that it's important to know that abusive partners target people you would not think, right? I was a former investigative reporter. I uncovered crime and corruption and chased people down with a microphone. You would think that someone like me would not fall for someone like that.
Nothing about you says easy to manipulate. Nothing about you.
That's good. Right. But I say this to my clients all the time. In many instances, narcissistic partners want someone who looks good on their arm, who is strong and independent to some degree, and then they want to break you down little by little. It's coercive control. It is that proverbial frog in the water. And for me, it wasn't physical situation, but financial abuse, coercive control, gaslighting, lying, manipulation, all of those things. And I think it's also important to point out that it takes on average 7 times for an abuse victim to leave. So many of us left and came back, or gave it another chance, or put in another try for the children, or were manipulated into not leaving. I just had a consultation with a woman this morning who said, I tried to leave 10 years ago and I couldn't. So I've been waiting till the kids go off to college. I hear this all the time. I'm out here trying to dispel this myth that it is the broken down and out, of course, woman or man who falls for a predatory type. Not at all.
And I think 2 things to point out for me that come to mind as you're speaking. Number one is, even the abusive partner sometimes does not understand what they're doing. They only know how to have unhealthy relationships. They only know how to hold on through coercion. None of that is the healthy partner's problem or responsibility, but it does become their burden. And it can take a long time to see these things for what they are, and the pattern, and the fact that it's never going to get better. It's only going to get worse because, like you said, they will target oftentimes externally as well as internally high functioning partners. And what does that partner do? We make it okay.
They want someone who is committed to marriage, takes these vows seriously, doesn't throw in the towel, sees a challenge and is like, I can do this, right? These are people who are truly committed, and they count on that because you start to explain away things, or you bargain, you go against your own values in some cases. And so many of my clients, and I felt this way myself, when they're escaping, are like, who have I become? This is not me. This is not who I am.
How did I get here? I just had an episode that I did recently with Dr. Peter Salerno. He coined the term abusive attunement.
Mm-hmm.
And I got laser focused on it. And I thought, that's what we should be teaching young people these days, not just women. We should be teaching them about abusive attunement, because no matter how emotionally aware you think you are, you only have the template of maybe what you grew up with and what your other relationships were. And so if you don't worry about whether someone's attunement is real, you will believe it. It doesn't mean you're stupid, it doesn't mean anything. It just means if people don't know how to operate in healthy ways, they will operate in unhealthy ways towards you. And if you are a problem solver, boy, are you in trouble. Most married people know very little about divorce, and they prefer to keep it that way. But what they don't know can hurt them and those they love for a lifetime. My guest this week learned that the hard way during her own divorce process and then the aftermath of launching a small women's support group that led her from her original career as an investigative reporter to her new life as Amy Polacko, the Freedom Warrior. A certified coach and divorce specialist, Amy has dedicated herself to helping people distinguish between frustration and abuse, understanding the meaning of coercive control, and when it is necessary, how to take steps to get out of the marriages that they never signed up for. On today's podcast, we are talking about the labyrinth of family court that often mistakenly sides with abusers, as evidenced in Amy's book, Framed. We are looking at the origin and the threat to no fault divorce and what that would mean for our rights to escape from unhealthy situations. And we are uncovering the real implications of the push to instate something called covenant marriage, a type of legal contract that is so horribly restrictive, it sounds like we might as well just assume that getting married means till death do you part, even if he might in fact kill you. What led you to becoming a divorce coach?
Well, I did not have anyone helping me really. So I was a babe in the woods in family court. I made a lot of mistakes both times. And I started a support group in my living room. I'm in a little cute Connecticut town where I thought I'm going to be the only one divorced, right?
So not Greenwich, because everyone's divorced in Greenwich.
No, I'm farther north and it's like a little Norman Rockwell town. So I thought to myself, I'm going to be like that Hester Prynne, from the Scarlet Letter with a big D on my chest. But I met other women going through it. We started meeting at my house. Women started sending their friends to me who were thinking about it. And that's when I got my coaching certification and all that, because I feel that women have been kept in the dark in the divorce process, and knowledge is power. I think they've been taken advantage of in many ways by their spouses, by so-called professionals, by the system. And it's up to us to become the CEO of our own divorce. And that's what I am big on now. If you're leaving an abusive partner, you can't just file papers or tell them I want a divorce. I mean, there are a bunch of ducks you have to get in a row. There's a strategy. That's how it started. I started my coaching business. It's called Freedom Warrior for a reason. I don't know if you can see this Joan of Arc quote over me, over my shoulder.
I was made for this.
Yes. And I tell my clients all the time, it's time to put the armor on. You know what I mean? I think what stops women from getting out of these unhealthy relationships a lot of times is fear. And so they need a cheerleader. They need a buddy. And you're not going to get a buddy out of your attorney, and they're going to charge you $1,000 an hour.
No, it's not their function. It's not their
Right.
function. And I think it's also, in terms of metaphors you can use for divorce, you talk about a lot of people being afraid to get a divorce, but there's also, despite all the death by a thousand cuts lies you can tell yourself when you're in an unhealthy relationship to try to make it work, because we tell ourselves 1,000 death by a thousand cuts lies to get ourselves to keep studying hard enough to get into law school. We do all the things. We've been doing this our whole lives. The problem is all those little lies feel like a betrayal of yourself once you leave and you have to finally admit you were wrong. You were wrong. It was never going to get better and all of that. And so the process of leaving then becomes like swimming to another, like imagine getting out of jail and swimming back to shore, but you're bleeding and now you're bleeding worse and you're swimming and you're resensitizing while you're fighting. That is the thing that people don't understand. And I think there's a lot of secrecy around divorce and around what happens in family court because people are embarrassed at how little they knew and what went wrong. And, oh, I should have done this differently. I should have done that differently. So I think you really are, fighting the good fight, because especially when it comes to children, people are terrified. Look, I made light of things at the opening because we have to laugh, right? You and I are not, nobody's getting through this if we're not laughing. And I'm sure that the women who meet at your house are laughing, right? because life is still beautiful even in the midst of all this. But your work is quite serious, and your book Framed really, it seems, is targeted at illustrating the mess of family court and the dysfunction of family court in many cases when it comes to discerning who's healthy, who's not, and what's in the best interest of the children at the end of the day. You do a lot to advocate for clarity. Freedom Warrior is the name. Can you tell me about the history of no fault divorce and why it matters that they're trying to end it in America?
Right. Well, no fault divorce came into effect in 1969. It was Governor Ronald Reagan of California at the time who started it there. And all 50 states have some version of no fault divorce because before that, it's important to know that there were huge obstacles for people who wanted to get divorced. They had to prove things like abandonment, that, someone had an alcohol problem, that they were insane, all of these things. And it was very cumbersome. So this was widely accepted that no fault made sense, but it's only now recently where some religious groups really want to peel back no fault divorce and end this freedom. And it affects so many people, male or female, but let's face it, in our society, the majority are female who are domestic abuse victims. And right now, as we illustrate in our book Frame that you talked about, it's, 22 stories of real women in family court. It's already extremely challenging, gender biased for women going through divorce and proving these things. These are all domestic abuse victims who are trying to prove they were abused. Their children, some children are sexually abused in our book, and the abuser actually gets custody of them. So that's what we're up against. And most people, if you're listening to this and you're out there and you're married and happily married, you have no idea what this world is. That's why we wrote the book. We want everyone to read it because even if it hasn't affected you yet, it could. You have daughters, you have friends, you have sisters, you have mothers,
You
you
have
have
friends
sons,
who
right?
are crumbling in the process of their divorce. You don't understand why. And if you read this book, you'll see they're up against an entire system that is forcing them to make horrible choices that they can't even
Right.
talk to you about.
Right, exactly. So having no fault divorce has reduced suicide, domestic abuse, homicide of women, all of these things we can point to. So going backwards is going to turn those numbers in the other direction. It's going to say to abused women, okay, there's already this family court upside down world nightmare you're going to have to deal with. But before you even get there, you're going to have to prove that you have a right to get divorced. So proponents of getting rid of no fault divorce will say, well, of course there are exceptions for abuse and things like that. That sounds great on the surface, but do you know what the burden of proof is for that? Do you know that only 41% of women in our family court system in a divorce are believed when they report abuse? So you're putting, this criteria on them. They may never even get here. They will end up trapped. They may not even ever get to the family court process.
Do you know what was the original impetus for no fault divorce? Was there some statistic that got Reagan over the hump?
Well, he himself had been divorced, so he understood it. And I think he was a high profile person who had said this doesn't make sense. And look, our court system is overloaded as it is. So to make it so cumbersome has definitely was affecting, how much money it took, how long these cases took. It was thought that with no fault divorce, it could be expedited, keep things moving more smoothly.
Yeah. But then the problem becomes family court. I will say when I was getting divorced, the one piece of advice I got from everyone was do whatever you can to stay out of family court. But the idea was do not push to family court because you do not know what's going to happen. I do wonder with the people who want to get rid of no fault divorce, whether it's religiously based, whether it's control based over women, and they personally feel that's unacceptable. And so they just want to throw the book at people and say, nope, stay with the
Well,
person forever.
yeah, I think it's all of the above. One of the critics of no fault divorce said it's like people are putting marriage on and off like underwear or
Oh,
something like
yeah,
that.
yeah,
And
yeah,
that people have
changing
become so
spouses, like
flippant about it that it's
right.
destroying our culture, it's
It's
destroying
so
our
offensive.
morality. The family unit has broken apart because of no fault divorce. what it ignores is that, yes, roughly 70% of divorces are filed by women, but about a quarter of those report domestic abuse. So couldn't it be that abusive situations are fueling some of the divorces? And by the way, the divorce rate went down after no fault was instituted. But yes, there is this return to this, days gone by where everyone got married and stayed married no matter what. Like that is a badge of honor. And, many people will say, grandma, stayed in her marriage for 50 years because she was forced to, because of financial abuse, because maybe she's experiencing other kinds of abuse. It wasn't that she was particularly happy there.
Oh, and by the way, she couldn't even get a credit card in her name until the 1970s. So let's just be clear about
Exactly.
some of the landscape of decision making that women were dealing with. But what happens if they instate covenant marriage? You had talked in one of your posts about Oklahoma covenant marriage law, Louisiana, Arizona, Arkansas. Tell me, what is covenant marriage and who invented this horrifying concept and what does it mean?
Well, it is the religious right? It's a legally distinct kind of marriage. And right now it exists in 3 states, Louisiana, Arkansas, and Arizona. By the way, our Speaker of the House is from Louisiana, and he is in a covenant marriage. So what happens is that the marrying spouses agree to this contract basically, and they accept limited terms for divorcing down the road. Right now, a proposed bill in Tennessee could add that state to the list of recognizing covenant marriages. And, again, this is to promote this institution, reduce the rate of divorce, decrease the number of children born out of wedlock, they say, discourage cohabitation, reframe marriage as this honorable institution. Because any way you cut it, fewer people are getting married. We see that in the statistics, right?
And it's not
So
as if
what,
like they could allow abortion to reduce the births out of
right?
wedlock. It's not as if it's not as if there are any men in covenant marriages who are cheating and impregnating other people, because that would never happen. It's
Right,
not as
of
if there's ever
course.
been a rape in any of those households. So it's such an elegant solution.
It's always the woman's fault, right? So whereas in no fault divorce, there's some leniency in the requirements to get a divorce. If someone wants to get a divorce, they are allowed to in every state right now. But if you have entered into a covenant marriage, a spouse has to prove one of the following things: that there was adultery, that your spouse committed a felony, they're engaging in substance abuse, they sexually or physically abuse you or a child, or the fact that you've been living separately for a certain period of time, depending on the state. I want to go back to the abuse criteria, because a lot of these discussions about covenant marriage restrict abuse to physical or sexual. And we talk about in the book, something I've written about as a journalist for Ms. Magazine extensively, is coercive control. That's the underpinning of all abuse. It does not always leave marks. It's not always sexual or physical. Whereas we
Define
have
it.
had, right.
Define it for my listeners.
Coercive control is a pattern of behavior where one person is exerting power and control over the other. It could be through intimidation, manipulation, and some of these other things. Sometimes it's tracking them and monitoring them, cutting off resources to even basic things like food and heat and transportation, stopping someone from working. There was a pretty well-known case, I think it was about a year ago in California, where there was a husband who went off to work and left a list, very extensive list every day of things his wife had to get done while he was gone. And it was coercive control.
And then naysayers will say, well, why didn't she just leave? And I think it's important you make the point that it's a pattern. It's a pattern of controlling behavior designed to create a situation where this person feels that it is either normal or acceptable or inescapable.
Yes, inescapable. Your money has been taken away and you get a little allowance every week to buy groceries, and he's monitoring that. How do you leave if you have no family nearby? If if you can't leave with the children, you could be accused of kidnapping the children and keeping them away from their dad. So in many cases, women are damned if they do and damned if they don't. So saying, why don't you just leave, sounds so great. That person has never been in that situation.
Obviously, nobody who would ever say, "Why don't you just leave?" to anyone in any situation has never been through it. And the through line is basically a lack of compassion, because when people say, changing spouses like they're changing their underwear, what a massive lack of compassion that shows. Do you think anybody want to put themselves and their children through divorce by choice for fun? That is offensive. It's like when people say, "Well, I don't want abortion because people are using abortion as birth control." How offensive. How offensive to people, you know?
There's a huge systemic society-wide ignorance about and lack of empathy about abuse and how it manifests itself. Oftentimes in family court, women are seen as a manipulator, a hysterical,
Oh, hysterical.
crazy,
Yeah.
depicted all these ways. And also, they're met with this attitude by judges or other professionals like, you married him, it's your problem. You should have seen this. What they don't realize is that abusers don't show up as a perpetrator and the evil villain you see in a movie. They show up as the great guy. They show up as Prince Charming right out of a Disney film.
Yeah. I interviewed recently Jennifer Muscatel, who runs a single mom society.
Love
She's
her. I love her.
hilarious, right? Because she
Love
does
her.
this
Oh my
like,
gosh, everybody, please go watch her reel on. She
which one?
depicts a family court judge, and I have watched it multiple times. I'm like doubled over because she made a dark, depressing topic hilarious
Really good.
because we have to laugh at how ridiculous some of them are.
Her timing, her affect is so perfect. I love the one where she's like, single moms, all you needed to do was just get your government issued crystal ball, and it's your fault because you didn't look in it before you married him. She just stares in the camera and you're like, are you okay? And I interviewed her, and she's just a wonderful, smart, sharp, and happening to be hilarious woman. But
Right.
so I just want to go back to touch on this point, because I really think people need to understand covenant marriage is a legal construct they want to add in all these other states that says the burden of proof goes beyond no fault, and you can only divorce for specific reasons, but you have to be able to prove. Is there any consistency in the definition of prove, or is it totally up to the personal opinion of the judge whether you have proved?
Well, that's the thing. I mean, you're hitting the nail on the head. It's so subjective, right? I know cases in family court where the woman was never even allowed to present her case. I don't know if you're familiar with the Catherine Kasanoff case. I wrote
Somewhat.
a
She was in New York. She was in upstate New
yes.
York, right? Right. Remind for people listening.
Yeah. Catherine Kasanoff was a New York mother. She was an attorney who worked for Governor Kathy Hochul, extremely bright in her own right. I did the first story anyone ever did on her in Ms. Magazine in 2021 on her case. I did it on her and another protective mom, Kobe Jane, and they had both lost custody of their children. So what happened in that case is she was labeled the manipulator who alienated the children from their father. She was evicted from their home. She had very limited visits with her children. She fought this. And she was a bright legal mind. So many of us who knew family court thought, wow, if anyone's going to go up against the system, it's her. Ultimately, she thought she was getting some good news. She had evaluators kicked off the case. I mean, for conflicts of interest and all of these things that she proved. Ultimately, she thought she was going to get unsupervised visits with her three daughters again. And then there was a reversal yet again. And she sadly took her own life at an assisted living facility in Switzerland. So I did many stories on her case, of course, after her death. And one of them talks about how women and abuse victims in family court do not get their due process rights. They are often not even heard or not allowed to present their evidence or even talk. Or if the abuser does an ex parte emergency motion, which is part of the abuser's playbook, one of their favorite tools, they don't even get a chance to respond before their children could be taken away or all of these things. And once that narrative is posited in family court, it's so hard to dismantle. It really is. Yes, this goes against civil rights. I quoted many legal experts in this case, and you hit the nail on the head with these new no fault, and covenant marriage laws, is that it's entirely up to family court, and that's terrifying.
It's interesting that you say due process. It really is kind of violating the rights of the children because it's making a decision about their welfare without the simple commitment to hearing all the information. If you do not let her state her case, the bare minimum I would think, forget who you believe, the woman or the man. Even if the man is terrible or the woman is terrible, wouldn't you think that for the basic purposes of potential welfare for the children, it would make sense to mandate that you have to let both of them state their case? Because what if the court's missing something?
Well, they really look at it through the lens of the best interests of the child, right? So, to give a little history for everybody, years ago in this country, we went by something called the tender years doctrine, where a lot of times custody was given to usually a mother who had been home and spent the most time with the children. Could have been a dad if he was a stay at home dad, but it recognized the fact that they had a psychological bond that should not be broken with their primary caregiver. Over the past few decades, that has changed thanks to the men's rights movement. And they have fought for more rights. They've won more visitation, which is great if the person is healthy, right? And so courts are often just deferring to 50-50 no matter what. And they believe that the best interest of the child is having equal time with both parents. So that's even overlooking a host of evidence. I know stories, I have clients, we have stories in the book where, there are alcohol problems, there are substance abuse problems, there's demonstrated evidence of physical abuse or sexual abuse of the children, but the case is made, he's a loving dad who just wants to spend time with his children. And there's so much empathy we talk about in the book in family court, that there's an inordinate amount of sympathy given to abusers, and they're allowed to have custody. And sometimes they even wrest the custody away from the other parent.
For a while, I thought it was a backlash against maybe women who had abused the system in the 60s and now things swung in the other direction. But it's actually far worse than that when you really look into it. Quick question on the Kasanoff case. Two things for clarification, because I don't know this. In the beginning, was there an incident or an allegation based upon which she started to be painted as not a fair parent? And then the second question is, where are the children now?
Well, there was an allegation of abuse by one of the children. They reported that their father had allegedly kicked one of them, and that's where it started. And soon after that, Catherine's husband filed for divorce, and then he filed for custody of the kids, and that's how it started. For the record, I want to say, has vehemently denied this. He did not speak to me for the majority of my Ms. Magazine articles, even though I reached out to him, except the last one. He did respond and send information. The children are with him right now. I have spoken extensively to Catherine's good friend and the executor of her estate, Wayne Baker. He's an attorney himself. He's been very vocal about how our court system is weaponized, especially in these wealthy divorces in these certain areas. He said, look, it's Westchester County, New York, just north of New York City. It's no coincidence, right? I grew up on a dairy farm in upstate New York. I'm not saying it's not fair up there, but it's not happening so much. We're not hearing about it there. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I do. I do.
It's a place where people can make money from these protracted wars in family court.
So I wonder if what happened in that case was people being angry about a divorce. But I mean, whenever a woman gets no custody, I find it shocking. I find it really shocking. And I'm always going to say, was there documented drug abuse? Because I cannot fathom any other situation which a mom literally doesn't even see her kids. I really don't.
Well, I think that when you read our book, you are going to see, because there's 22 stories, and many of the women have lost custody of their children. And I have clients who have lost custody of their children, and they are good mothers. And I'm not just saying that because they're my clients. I think if you went out on the street and asked average Americans who gets custody when a couple divorces, they're going to say the mother, and a lot of men will say, oh, the mother always does, or she gets more custody. That's not the case anymore. And what has sensitized the family court system is this allegation of parental alienation. So let's talk about that for a second. We
Yes.
actually don't like to use that term. We like to call it something called CAMS, children and mother sabotage, child and mother sabotage, because basically parental alienation is a term that's been co opted by this men's rights movement. And as soon as a court feels she's an alienator, she's keeping the children from this dad who just wants to be in their lives, it's like this cancer in our family court system. So if you're called that, immediately you can lose custody of your children. Catherine Kasanoff was accused of not facilitating and turning her daughters against the dad, and she could not kind of shake that label.
Yeah. And it could be something as simple as a child telling their parent, I don't like being at daddy's house, or daddy doesn't let me call you when I want to. And then, God forbid, the dad says, oh, well, this kid's making up stories because the mom told him to say that. And now who are you going to believe? And the concept of alienation has been weaponized against good mothers. And I just find it horrifying because at the end of the day, unless there is physical harm to come to the children, even if a man cannot feed or even barely even speak in full sentences to his child, it is generally understood that women want the dad to be in the life of the child no matter what.
Absolutely.
So why shouldn't it be both ways? What it does to a child's nervous system to not have their mother in their life, I just simply cannot fathom. And I have a great mom and a great dad, so I'm not saying dads don't have a great effect,
Right.
but your mom and your nervous system, I don't. Anyway, I'll get off my.
No, so you can see the intergenerational trauma we are.
So, the dysfunction of family court is kind of the crux of the book and kind of what you're trying to bring to light.
Yes, and I want to say that my co-author is Dr. Christine Cochiola, who's an expert on coercive control. So we had been talking, and we hear these stories every day, and it's not that we get desensitized because we've heard so many of them. They still hit us so hard, and we work with these women helping them. So we really want the world to see what happens behind the closed doors of family court.
Well, and you do talk about some of the statistics, and even on your social media, you talk about some of the statistics around people being believed or disbelieved in family court. But you make the point that people who are considering or who want a divorce might want to consider getting it now. Can you explain why?
Absolutely. And I'm not saying that because I'm a divorce coach, everybody. I'm saying that because I'm in the trenches and I've also been through it. I believe that we're headed in this country toward a more restrictive divorce process. Can I predict in a crystal ball which states might get rid of no fault divorce? Of course not. But they're going to be less receptive to women wanting to get out of a marriage. We are seeing that in our society. We're seeing that in our administration and conservatives across the country. So if you're on the fence, do it now. I had a client say to me, I can't speak about this publicly. I need you to say this to other women. Don't wait. I think oftentimes we as women will do anything for our kids, right? We think, okay, I'm going to stay for the kids. I'm going to stay for the kids. But the reality is you could be modeling a really toxic situation to your kids. We don't want our kids to grow up and leave these family units and go choose a partner that was like our abuser. So I think that most women, I find when I work with them as a coach, I'm building up their confidence. Every bit of knowledge they get, they think, okay, I can do this. I can do this, right? I never push anyone into divorce. Of course, if there's a chance at saving the marriage and it's healthy.
Of course, we all want that.
Right.
Nobody wants this level of stress for anyone, with or without children. But I do think it's important that you point out that people need to be aware. And one of the things I was thinking about when I saw that post of yours telling people that if they want to move, they should move was covenant marriage is going to require proof of abuse. If we're assuming proof of abuse, it could be documented with videotape. You don't know the laws in your state. You may have videotape up the wazoo of him literally beating you and your children, and you may never have it see the light of day. If you need a divorce, you don't need a reason. Get the divorce. If you are going to stay for the children, consider that you might need to leave for the children, right?
Absolutely. I have helped many women escape, and they may have changed their lifestyle and made a bunch of sacrifices, but they tell me peace is priceless.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know if you've seen that post I've shared many times. It's like a mattress, a phone, and a TV. And it says, sometimes peace starts like this. What I often have to say to clients is that I'm not going to push you into this decision, but what I can tell you from my experience is, and I literally take my hand and say, it's escalating. I rarely see it go down. The situation, what you're telling me he's doing, what he's saying, the environment in your home, it's getting worse. It's not going to get better. Because I think we do gaslight ourselves sometimes because we want to keep a family unit together, don't want our kids to have to go through divorce. So we will talk ourselves out. You have one good day, you went to the movies together and it was okay. You start saying, well, maybe it's not that bad. And you start excusing away something he did last week. And
And because
the thing
things don't
is,
get discussed, death
right?
by a thousand cuts, but it can also actually literally be death to our cortisol levels, to our health. There's a reason why women have like what 75% of inflammatory disorders
Hmm.
and everything. It's all us, right? Because we're literally dying from the inside to keep the world
Yes.
spinning the way that it does.
Yes.
You run your support group and obviously very passionate about this. You obviously know from what you speak because you have been through all of this. I think something else people often don't talk about is that, like, and this is important when divorcing, the one piece of advice I've given to women is once you've decided, do not delay. And that means the day that you ask for the divorce, you file for the divorce. And whatever it takes to negotiate, get that paper signed because there is an energetic link that needs to be cut and there's a new life that needs to begin and you can spend 20 years trying to get to that new life, then what did you gain, right? But you do run a support group. You help women who are escaping from emotionally but also physically abusive relationships. So as I was watching your media, I was thinking and I was hoping I knew the answer to this. I'm scared of the answer to this. Have you ever been physically threatened by the ex of a client or the pending ex of a client? What you're
No, I
doing is
have
going to
not.
make people mad.
I have not. It's crossed my mind, of course. I,
Good.
I get all sorts of
Good.
delightful messages from
So, like,
different men on social media in reaction to my posts. So, like, I'm a liar and, all these things, scam artist and things like that. And I'm going to go to hell for helping women escape.
well, you're smart, you're pretty, and you're doing God's work is my counterpoint, yeah. So,
Thank you. That's what I said. I'm doing God's work,
you're
right?
doing God's work.
Right. So I am very careful. I do encourage clients, obviously, and this is something we should talk about, is that have a secret phone, have a, email address that they don't know about. Be careful about communications because you don't really want them to know you're working with me. I have had women send me a money order through the mail or in my area, I've met women and they've paid me cash. We met at Whole Foods or it's funny. It's like we're like doing a drug deal in the parking lot. But whatever makes them feel better. But I do have a funny story.
Meet me by the avocados. Okay, yeah.
I know. I do have a funny story about this because one of my clients' husbands did find the charge and looked me up, right? And so he started kind of mocking her and saying she was working with a shaman.
Yeah, mockery is a great way to
Yes,
keep
no,
your
no.
wife from leaving you. That's great. Last question for you. You are a single mom. You have been through this before, and like you said, you didn't have help. What do you wish you could go back and say maybe to yourself or to your child when all of this was first unfolding? One thing, like if one piece of advice.
I think if I could go back to myself going through divorce, I would say, you're strong, stick to your guns. You know who you are. It's a very vulnerable time and you're scared. And it's like entering into a Twilight Zone galaxy you know nothing about. So when someone tells you, you should take this deal, or this is the best you're going to get, or, this is totally normal, or this is fine, or in my case, post divorce, I was in mediation. He doesn't have to submit his financials because you're going to come up with an agreement anyway. Why did he not have to submit his financials? I look back, the Amy now would have never stood for that then. And I learned so much though. And I'm taking those lessons and giving them to women now. I have a whole digital course called Divorce Decoded, and I have an entire module called Family Court Warnings. And I really don't think women are getting this anywhere else. We could talk about getting your financial documents around. I cover everything in this course, but this is what you must know when you walk into this world. That's what women have got to arm themselves with. That's what I wish I knew. And I wish I trusted myself that this doesn't seem right. This seems really weird. Like, is this
Well,
really happening? Like, this is
yeah.
crazy.
If I could go back and say to myself anything, I know what I would say, which is, "You're not wrong about anything you're thinking right now. You're just not wrong. I'm so sorry," because it would have made me move faster in all of my decisions in my life. When you get divorced, especially if you're one of the first in your circles to get divorced, many of us have this experience of suddenly everybody wants to pull you aside at a dinner party and say, "I'm really unhappy," because they feel safe to tell you now how bad their marriage is really getting. Thankfully, almost 75% of the time, I find myself asking my friend a few questions, male or female, and then saying, "Honestly, I don't think you need a divorce. What you have is a marriage that's annoying. You don't have an abusive situation unless you're not telling me something." And I'm so grateful that that's what I say most of the time because
Mhm.
we're not pro everybody getting divorced. We are pro happy marriage and
Of
happy
course.
people. But I will say, I'm glad that you have turned what you went through into what you've created in your book and your course. And for the other 25%, I'll be sending them your way.
I agree with you. And look, I always joke with my married friends, many were very supportive at my our book launch events and everything. I joked with them, said, you probably went home and hugged your husband a little tighter. And you said, yeah, those dirty socks you threw on the floor in the bedroom, no big deal anymore. Keep doing it. No problem.
Handsome. And then he woke up the next morning and said, "Honey, why don't I take the kids to school and you sleep in?" And they both just kind of looked at each other like, "Don't leave me." That's a happy end. Thank you for being my guest.